Hey friends, my name is Ethan Harvey and I'm a visual artist from Kansas. Today we're going to be looking back at an old drawing of Spider-Man that I made about 16 years ago to see how I've changed and grown technically, as well as a bit of a narrative device to see how far I've grown and come as an artist since then. I have folders upon folders of old drawings from when I was a kid, so if you like this, let me know and I might turn it into a series. I've been off and on YouTube for over a decade, but I think this would be a great time to reintroduce myself. I opened my very first YouTube account called Blender Animator in June of 2009. I was actually homeschooled for my entire childhood, so I had a lot of free time to pursue my passions and interests. And at the time, I was very interested in Blender animations and tutorials on YouTube. I just couldn't wait to add my voice to that conversation. Side note, remember a few years ago when those stickman animations were super popular on Newgrounds and YouTube? Yeah, I was obsessed with those. I loved them, and that's actually part of the reason why I got into animation and art in the first place. Since 2009, however, I've actually made several different channels and a lot of different kinds of content. Each type of content changing with what I was interested in at the time. Everything from design to filmmaking to comedy and more animation. As a kid, I spent countless hours copying poses and panels out of comic books both new and old, learning basics like anatomy and composition along the way. However, the drawing we're looking at today was actually inspired by the 1980s cartoon Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, featuring a lesser-known trio of Spider-Man, Iceman, and Firestar.
Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, Iceman and Firestar.
This particular composition was actually inspired by Ultimate Spider-Man, Volume 1, number 118. Let's go ahead and jump into it with some anatomy and pose references. I prefer to use references for my anatomy and pose because every time I try to draw from my head, there's something I forget. Here I've decided to use a free tool called PoseMy.art, which has tons of free models to choose from. However, you can only have one model pose at a single time, so I got around that by posing each model separately, then taking screenshots and arranging them together in Photoshop to fit my desired composition. Speaking of Photoshop, I went ahead and created a document at the size that I wanted my final size to be and set up some layers, and then brought in my anatomy reference. I will go ahead and save the file and then airdrop it over to my iPad. From there, I will begin by sketching out the skeletons and anatomy of my characters using that anatomy pose as reference. I also had a hard time deciding what to do for the background. I had a bad habit when I was a kid of just skipping backgrounds, and I didn't want to make that same mistake here. Sadly, the inspiring work wasn't too much help in this regard, apart from just some color inspiration. I decided to add a full cityscape, replicating the ways old comic artists would use atmospheric perspective and simplified shapes and color to separate foreground and background. I think this will be a great step up from the first drawing.
Where you going? Where?
Once the rough sketch is finished, I will go back through and do a bit of a cleanup sketch to decide on my lines and choose exactly where I want things to be before I go back with the ink pass. I'll be using a textured ink bleeding brush to invoke a feeling of classic print comic books and hand-animated cartoons. If I go for a lot of gradients and smooth colors, it'll feel a lot less like a vintage comic book. Now that the ink pass is done, it's finally time to add in some color. I think I'm going to go for a single base color pass followed by one shadow and one highlight pass respectively. I'm especially excited to pursue my wide variety of interests on this channel. In the 16 years since I drew that first piece of art, I've had the chance to pursue and explore tons of different interests. Everything from digital signage to 3D and 2D animation to branding and design and even marketing.
Where you going?
In my day job, I create constantly. I spend hours and hours each week designing logos, laying out marketing materials, and managing a brand. To the point where you think I would be sick of creating, or at least creatively burnt out, but that's really not the case. I am absolutely infatuated with creating, and have been falling back in love with illustration a lot recently. However, I have struggled with finding a meaningful way to share what I've been creating, which ultimately leads me to feel a certain lack of fulfillment with the creative process. Art is meant to be shared, not hoarded. So that's why I'm here, on YouTube again after all these years, to share what I create and close that loop of creativity. As for the drawing, I decided to keep the shading and details pretty simple and flat, trying to replicate both more tangible like pen and paper comic book look, as well as the kind of painted cartoon look from the 80s. I also decided to keep their costumes pretty simple. In the age of super realistic MCU costumes, I really admire the simple graphic qualities of these old retro superhero costumes, so I decided to replicate that again here. In addition to being a bit more realistic, the original Ultimates cover is also much more of a modern take on rendering these styles. We have a lot of effects and digital painting on top of the initial pencils and ink work. So I decided to go in the opposite direction, keeping my shading simple and effects to a minimum. I really love the way that textured brushes and effects and ink bleeds and things like that can really add to the feeling of a tangible drawing. However, I did use some less than analog effects for Firestar's trail and Iceman's body. I know he's usually depicted as being covered in ice, but I thought making him made entirely of ice was much more fantastical and fun. Lastly, I also leaned into the analog look with how I styled some of the shading, like I did here with the uneven edges on Iceman's highlight, replicating either a more hand-painted or maybe misaligned print look.
Where you going?
And with a final pass with some effects and cleanup, we have the final illustration. Real quick, let's take a look at both of them side by side. Thanks for watching along with me as we took this trip down memory lane. I hope this video has inspired you to revisit your artistic roots and embrace how far you've come, or maybe even pick up a pencil or stylus again. Either way, I am so looking forward to what we can create here in this space together. So until next time, friends.